Oi, oi, all right, how's it going? I'm Grant, you're you. This is the Doodle Review, coming through today with a deep dive on 10 obscure, unreleased, or otherwise hidden Queens of the Stone Age tracks. The thumbnail, the title of this video, of course, in an attempt to draw you here, says 10 Queens tracks you've never heard, and ultimately, the biggest Queens fans among you probably will have heard some of them. Some of them are on YouTube. But that isn't a reason to skip because I'm going to do my level best to give you the stories behind each of these tracks and hopefully tell you something you didn't already know. I've gone deep in my research. We're talking Oppenheimer's brother, Until Tomorrow, Anderson. We are going to get really deep into it. Don't worry. If you like Queens, you've got to check out though my interview with Gene Troutman, the drummer from the band's Rated R era. And if you want to get new album reviews in your inbox every week, sign up to the new newsletter. The link is down there in the description alongside all of those videos. All right, 10 Queens of the Stone Age non-album hidden tracks going from least to most obscure. Let's give it a go. All right, I wanted to start this list with the song Era Vulgaris because there's some pretty interesting backstory with this one. I'm aware that because it was basically included on every regional version of the Era Vulgaris album, that most of you have probably heard it, but you know, I did say least to most obscure, right? So I'm living up to that promise. The track's probably most notable because it's the first collaboration on record between Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails and Josh Homme. Reznor provides his trademark nasally but great vocals, and his presence really adds to the overall kind of apocalyptic vibe of this song, which describes crumbling towers and no love under modern skies. What a lot of people don't know is that Reznor actually invited Homme to sing on his own 2007 album before Vulgaris called Year Zero. The pair both confirmed in separate interviews around this time period that Homme contributed vocals to what sounds like could have been a slower, ethereal Nails track for the album, but for whatever reason, it wasn't included on the final track listing. And I've been hoping for the last 20 years that we'd hear this at some point, but alas, so far nothing yet. So other than a tit for tat, you dropped me first, so I'm dropping you, which Homme did kind of jokingly allude to, why did they leave Era Vulgaris off its own album? Well, in an interview with The Skinny, band guitarist and all-around Swiss Army knife Troy Van Leeuwen suggested it was left off simply because it kind of didn't fit with the rest of the record, that it was kind of dark and gritty in a way that not much else is on the LP. I don't know if I really agree with that. Like River in the Road and Run Pig Run are pretty pitch black towards the end there. But the song doesn't really have a start, which I guess makes it quite hard to place in the sequence of the album. There is another reason, though, that I think the song was dropped. At the time, Queens and Nails were signed to Interscope Records in a relationship that both Reznor and Homme publicly hated. Or they used almost every opportunity they could to slag off the Jimmy Iovine founded imprint. And I can't be sure on Reznor's side, but a big part of Homme leaving Era Vulgaris off the record, I think, was simply to fuck with them. And that's something that he kind of copped to in quite a few interviews around the time. The final part of the Era Vulgaris story is how it was released. And this is a tale close to my heart because before it emerged as a bonus track on various regional releases of the album it shares its name with, the band gave it out for free to competition winners run through the legendary Queens fan site, thefade.net. Guys or girls who ran that site, if you're watching, thank you. I was actually one of the winners of that contest, and as like a 15-year-old Queens fanatic, it was at that time probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. And yeah, I probably did need to get out more at the time. But after being informed I'd won, like a package was dispatched, and with pretty ropey web tracking back in the day, for the next week I practically had to run the mile and a half home from school just because I was so excited for it to arrive. When it did arrive, it came in this DVD case, Josh's Famous Dance Party, with a CD called You Know What You Did and a handwritten note from someone called Dr. Insider. The note instructed those that received the song to leak the track online via as many weird places as possible. This basically meant for like 24 hours, dorky fans like me were trespassing on other random forums and essentially rip-rolling the native users there with this track. And given Homme's nickname used to be J-Ho, naturally I went onto the Jennifer Lopez forum claiming that I had like a leaked version of her new single and put that there. Oh, how we laughed. I mean, I was such a nerd at the time, but what an experience it was to get that track. I still remember goosebumps of hearing that song first time. It was amazing. At number 9, it's one of my favorite all-time Queens Battleship tunes. The beast that is the Fun Machine took a shit and died. A song with one of the coolest myths behind it. This epic and fan favorite Queen's tune started life during the sessions for Lullabies to Paralyze. It was recorded and intended to be on that album, which, when you think of some of the chunky like Battleship tunes that are already on that LP, like Someone's in the Wolf or Blood is Love, is kind of a scary prospect. However, the tapes were stolen during the sessions. They couldn't recover these recordings, and this annoyed the band so much that they actually included a little notice on the sleeve of the album when it came out, offering a reward for the tape's return. Well, as it goes, Homme would later reveal that the tapes weren't actually stolen at all. They just got lost in the shuffle as they moved studios, but they weren't found until after Lullabies had already come out. So the tapes were found, but it wasn't clear if fans would ever hear the tune until a string of illnesses and surgeries caused the band to reschedule the London dates on the Lullabies tour so many times that they pressed the song onto a limited 7-inch vinyl and gave this to original ticket holders of those shows. The wider fan base didn't miss out though, because the band would occasionally add Fun Machine into their set lists, most notably at the London gigs, where it would be recorded and immortalized as part of the live DVD over the years and through the woods. The story didn't end there though, because the band then revisited Fun Machine again during the sessions for Era Vulgaris, and while it didn't make the track list, it was included in some of the regional editions as a bonus track, a new version different to the one on the 7-inch with new lyrics and new sections. So if you've been counting, that makes 3 versions of Fun Machine: the 7-inch, the Through the Woods live version, and the Era Vulgaris recording. The 7-inch version is almost bettered by the fact it only exists with the cracks and warbles of the vinyl transfer. It adds like an eerie layer to it, but for that same reason, the big moments suffer for being a little tinny. And if you actually have the record, I'm sure you have a different experience. And they do also include this crunchy distortion on the drums, which I think is pretty cool as well. For the longest time, the Through the Woods Fun Machine version was like my version. I listened to and watched it hundreds of times. So it's got a special place in my heart. It has a choppier tempo than the 7-inch edition. And despite being a live recording, due to the mixing and the great performance, it's actually better quality. You really feel the drums and bass here. And the arrangement has also been kind of smoothed out to be a little more succinct, but no less awesome. The Era Vulgaris edition adds some new, even more bombastic, explosive sections, and being a fully mixed, mastered official release has great quality. There are some weird touches though, like the Spanish guitars, which feel like one of those like felt good in the moment decisions, but in hindsight is a bit like, feels like a hat on a hat. Of the 3 recorded and released versions, I probably would still say the EV version is my favorite, just because those newer sections are fucking righteous. But if I had to tell you my definitive version, it would be the live recording from Rock Werchter 2011. There's that meme of someone coming home to find their boyfriend like watching a live show on YouTube. And Rock Werchter 2011 is like my version of that. The band are tight. It has all those sick sections, and they do this awesome little callback to an early instrumental Queen's song called Spiders and Vinegaroons, which is just like such an obscure pull, but works perfectly. I would definitely check it out if you haven't seen it. On now to a soundtrack cut. In 2021, a documentary was released to pay tribute to and explore the story of Anthony Bourdain. The world traveller, TV chef and punk rock lover sadly took his own life in 2018 and was a close friend of the Queens and Josh Homme specifically. The friendship between Bourdain and Homme had been forged in the mid-2000s after the kind of modern troubadours crossed paths on tour, hitting it off over their love of food, art and music. Fans got to witness this friendship blossom over the years, with Homme showing up on multiple episodes of Bourdain's show, and Bourdain in turn sometimes like contributing things like words or voiceovers to Homme projects. Based on this close relationship, Homme was not only asked to appear as one of the like talking heads in the Bourdain documentary, but to provide a song for the closing credits, and that song is Black and Blue Is the Best I Can Do. Now, sadly, the track's never seen any sort of streaming release and didn't really get much publicity at the time. But when the doc came out, I guess Homme was going through a public and very ugly divorce, so it's quite possible he wanted to lay low. One legend out there, though, did rip the track from the end credits and upload it to YouTube, so you can still find it, and it's well worth a look. Credited as written by Homme, but performed by Queens of the Stone Age. It's a punchy, simple, straightforward rock track. You could even be tempted to call it a little bland, but The driving attack on the guitars and the very Queensy kind of trippy breakdown elevates its simple conceit and makes it one I would come back to more if it was a bit more readily available. According to one of the very few write-ups I could actually find on the track, Homme describes Black and Blue as the first song he'd been able to actually write since Bourdain's death, having felt a complete lack of inspiration during the immediate aftermath of his friend's passing. That context gives this hidden gem of a track, a song that bridges the villains and Times New Roman era, a nice little added resonance and serves as a fitting tribute to both Bourdain and Homme's, troubled personas. We definitely can't talk about soundtracks without mentioning easily Queen's best soundtrack contribution, and that is the track Infinity off of Heavy Metal 2000, a sequel to the cult 80s animation Heavy Metal. Inspired by the fantasy genre, the Frank Frazetta-esque imagery of the original movie was very popular, particularly among the teenage boys of the era. And if you're my age, you probably might not have seen it, but you may have seen the South Park piss take of it called Major Bubage, which kind of portrays exactly why it was a hit amongst that particular demographic. A sequel was planned around the turn of the millennium to introduce the franchise, I guess, to a new generation of horned up nerds. And in order to do right by the heavy metal title, the creators assembled a pretty extensive list of artists who mostly all contributed original or unreleased tunes to the soundtrack. The album had at the time well-known artists like Pantera, Billy Idol and Bauhaus, but also then up-and-coming bands like Machine Head, System of a Down, and of course, Queens of the Stone Age. The Queens delivered one of my favourite songs for this set, the hypnotic, psychedelic cut called Infinity. This had been played a lot on the road between 98 and 2000, and they'd continue to pepper it into the set list very sporadically, even as late as 2011. There are two versions of Infinity, the OG Heavy Metal 2000 track and another version that they recorded in the Lullabies sessions that was released on the Japanese and vinyl editions of that album. The Lullabies version has some super slick guitar fills, likely from The Man, that is Troy Van Leeuwen, but I think the original just has the edge for me. The song really suits the early kind of psych-leaning version of the band. It's a little bit more raw, and for some reason the lyrics on that first version just work a little better for me anyway. Absolute banger, whichever version you prefer though. Next up, quite possibly the first ever Queens of the Stone Age track, at least the first that was ever released under the name anyway. 18 AD was released in 1997 on a compilation album called Burn One Up Music for Stoners, put out by Roadrunner Records. Doing my Discogs research, I think this release predates even the Caius Queen Split EP, which came out in December of 97. So based on that, I'm almost certain that 18 AD is indeed the first track released under the Queen's name. Another unique fact about this song is the lineup. Aside from Homme, who obviously takes vocals and guitar, joining him are Yves Nayon and Milo Beanhacker from the Dutch band Beaver on drums and bass. Beaver are a band Queens would tour with early on and even released a split EP with them. But until putting this vid together, I had no idea that those guys were actually in a very early iteration of the band. This track has always struck me as one that probably took them about as long to write as it did to play. It's very simple, but perfectly encapsulates the desert meets psych meets space rock sound of the band's short pre-2000s era. The production feels very rough and ready, which gives it a garage rock kind of charm. It's pretty much a guitar, bass and drum with some lead parts overdubbed. It's raw and rugged and to the point. So this is an interesting one. Cathedral City, presumably referencing the small desert city in Riverside, California, and not the cheddar cheese, is an instrumental track that came to light in an illicit leak of rare demos and tracks in the late 2000s, and we'll talk more about that later. But aside from the fact it's purported to have been recorded during the Era Vulgaris sessions, we don't really know much about it at all. If you attended or watched back a Queen show from early 05 with Mark Lanigan though, Cathedral City might sound familiar. At that time, the songs for the Death Cut, God Is in the Radio, was in those Lullabies set lists, but the band were playing a completely new version. Same lyrics, same vibe, but new riffs and new arrangement. Well, those new riffs and that new arrangement, as it turned out, was what we now know as Cathedral City. And when it leaked, Queen's nerds like me collectively became like the DiCaprio meme. There is some debate though among the fan base as whether that Cathedral City may actually be another as yet unheard Queen's tune, and what we know as that track has actually just been mislabeled. This dispute comes from the fact that God Is in the Radio in its earliest iterations played live in 2001 before Songs for the Deaf, it was actually known as Midgets and Diamonds. So the logic is that this track we're talking about is not Cathedral City, it's actually the Midgets and Diamonds version of God. But if you go back and listen to those live shows from '01, Midgets and Diamonds bears a lot more resemblance to the version of God that did end up on Deaf than it does the 2005 reworking. So this leads me to think that Cathedral City is the right name. But if me being wrong means there's another unheard Queen's track called Cathedral City out there, then let me be wrong. But assuming this is Cathedral City, its origins are unknown. Was this purposely written to freshen up God is in the Radio for the Lullabies tour? Was it a completely new track that they realized kind of through writing just sounded familiar to God? We don't really know. There's barely ever been a mention of it other than a little interview snippet prior to a TV performance of God, where they talk about how they decided to just play this new version just for fun. God is in the Radio is an absolute banger Queen's track. It's one of those battleship tunes, and it's up there with the likes of Fun Machine and Evil Has Landed in its scope. And it's mental to me that the band could just whip up a new version that honestly is as good as the original. And I wouldn't even be mad at anyone that says it's better either. It's an absolutely killer tune. Now over to the band's cover of Joe Walsh's In the City, commissioned for Rockstar's 2005 video game adaptation of the 1979 movie The Warriors. The source on this one is admittedly a little bit trust me bro. The band's contribution to the Warriors soundtrack and the Joe Walsh song specifically was announced, but when the Warriors game got released, Queens were nowhere to be heard on it, sadly. Before Reddit took over as the forum for everything, bands used to have like their own message boards, and the Queens one, Records, was sick. Long hours I used to spend there speculating on the band, downloading live shows, and getting new music recommendations. What made the forum like special though were posts from an enigmatic character called Blank, who was a mystery user that proved time and again they were somehow in the band's inner circle and would confirm or deny various rumors and drop little teasers. Maybe it's some form of Mandala effect, but I vividly remember a post in which Blank confirmed this cover of In the City did in fact exist and was recorded, but I've trawled the Wayback Machine to try and find it, and sadly no avail. I can't find it. But you know, this is really a trust me bro on top of another trust me bro. However, I wanted to include this one because in my hunt for information, I ended up listening to the whole Warriors soundtrack, and it is awesome, man. And what's interesting to me is why Queens were considered to do the Joe Walsh tune when the core theme of the Warriors by Barry DeVorzon would have made the perfect cover for the band. The Joe Walsh tune, if you haven't heard it, is like a 70s AM radio classic, and now with the band having delivered a 3-part harmony on the recent Emotion Sickness, them doing it kind of makes sense. But in 2005, based on the Queen's albums to date, it was fairly off the wall. The Barry DeVorzon theme song, when you hear it, I think it encapsulates the vibe the band have been summoning since kind of Era Vulgaris onward, and I think they might even have used it as walk-on music at some point to their shows. So look, the Queen's version of In the City is seemingly lost to the annals of time, but we actually have the Warriors film and soundtrack, and if you haven't experienced either, you got to do it, man. Get on it. Okay, now we're into the deep shit. Let's talk Oppenheimer's Brother, a track that for a long time was like an urban legend for Queen's collectors and remains a really weird part of their lore. I'm not sure how anyone really even knew of this song. For years it existed in name only, and I don't know what evidence there ever was that the band had penned a track called Oppenheimer's Brother. But somehow fans just knew. It wasn't on any early set lists, never once mentioned in an interview, but like cavemen knew that the sun rose and sun set every day without knowing what sun was, us Queens fans, we just fucking knew this song existed somehow. You might know that before settling on naming the band after Chris Goss's nickname for Caius whenever they were being, like in his eyes, divas, Queens of the Stone Age, before that, the band were known as Gamma Ray until a lawsuit forced a name change. But before that, a working title of the group was the Plastic Turks. This formation of the band at that time featured Josh Homme, Caius drummer Alfredo Hernandez, Dinosaur Jr. bassist and Mark Lanigan songwriter Mike Johnson, and John McBain on guitar. And McBain actually played quite a pivotal role in helping Homme coalesce what became Queens of the Stone Age during his kind of lost years after Caius, but it doesn't often get talked about. It was revealed at some stage that the Plastic Turks recorded in 1997 at Jupiter Studios in Seattle, and Oppenheimer's brother, among others, is what came out of those sessions. And it's so funny, man. I remember at the time that that info came out, 15-year-old me, or however old I was, emailed the studio asking if they'd share the tapes. And it just seems so silly now. Like, the studio would have the tapes, and as if they would share these unreleased recordings without like the band's permission. What can I say? I was young and reckless. But they did reply and let me down gently, to be fair to them, which, you know, it's quite nice. For the longest time, it seemed the track would forever just be this urban legend. But then, out of nowhere, there was a leak. The band were known to drop little tidbits through insiders back in the day, but this leak was clearly unsanctioned because the band's forum was like abruptly taken down when it happened. Anyway, this was big. Among the leaked tracks was Oppenheimer's brother. Also, we thought. A few years later, when the tracks had made their way onto YouTube, none other than John McBain himself would come forward and be like, hold up, this ain't it. He said maybe it was an old Caius demo, but it certainly wasn't Plastic Turks, and it wasn't Oppenheimer's brother. And John, I just want to say, if you're watching, I would love to have you on, not just to talk about this. Let's talk Monster Magnet. Let's talk Hater, Well Water. It would be great. Anyway, the mystery of Oppenheimer's brother, once thought to be solved, was back. As a fan, it wasn't really disappointing because we just got this other track that we'd never heard of and now learned there was still more to hear from this period. So things went quiet for a while again until a few years back, a former associate of the band's old label, Man's Ruin, possibly a former girlfriend of Hommy's, emerged with a tape, the Plastic Turks demo tape. And what was on it? Oppie's bro. Sadly, the whole tape, which featured multiple versions of this track and early versions of How to Handle a Rope and the Bronze, wasn't shared, but of the two tracks we did get it, finally, Oppenheimer's brother. The song itself is really delicate and chilled, like being named after the inventor of the atomic bomb. It turns out is kind of a complete misdirect. It builds to some grittier moments, but overall the track feels very light and airy. Front and center are Hommy's almost sheepish falsetto vocals that are double tracked in the way many of his earliest vocal tracks are. Though this production technique might have been used to kind of, I guess, boost the confidence of a singer just finding his feet, it also, maybe intentionally, maybe not, just offers this haunting kind of warbly texture that I think really aids the overall vibe. If you've ever listened to Well Water Conspiracy, John McBain project from the late 90s that Hommy featured on a few times, you'll hear some similarities in style for sure. Oppenheimer's brother is like a blend of the psychedelic approach of that band with the desert haze left behind of the departed Caius. The lyrics are kind of hard to decipher, but in the chorus, we clearly hear the words "Until Tomorrow," which leads me to think that this track inadvertently solves another Queen's mystery, which materialized much later during the Lullabies to Paralyze era. In The Way Finds You, the making of documentary that was released on the DVD edition of Lullabies, which I highly recommend giving a watch, the camera pans over a whiteboard tracking the progress of the band's recording. Though blurry, one of a few songs listed that remain unheard is a song called Until Tomorrow. In the years between that documentary and like before the ultimate release of Oppenheimer's brother, many assumed that Until Tomorrow had evolved to become Into the Hollow on Era Vulgaris due to those words being featured in the verse of that song. But I think it's a whole song of its own, and I think that song started as Oppenheimer's brother. So in some ways, even though this long-running Queen's mystery is solved, it also kind of lives on until hopefully one day when we eventually get to hear whatever Until Tomorrow is. So naturally, the next song we need to talk about is the song fans thought for a few years was Oppenheimer's brother. And that tune is called Otis and the Hookup. So to recap, this tune came out of that unsanctioned leak that brought down the band's forum, and it was released alongside another track fans had been hunting from the Plastic Turk session called Sherbet. In hindsight, we should probably have had some trepidation about the labeling of these tracks because what was called Sherbet was clearly another version of the song Rickshaw, one of the best cuts off the Desert Sessions project. And it could well have been just like a working title for what became Rickshaw, but we since learned from the tape that gave us the true Oppenheimer that Sherbet was indeed its own different song, something that McBain also mentioned in his comment that was disputing those first leaked recordings. But though it wasn't Oppenheimer's brother, The song is an otherwise unreleased gem from the earliest era of Queens of the Stone Age. What I can't seem to find out is where the title Otis and the Hookup came from. It feels too oddly specific to have been made up by a fan, but I wasn't able to find something official to tell us why it became Otis after it was proved not to be Oppenheimer. I did my research, but came up short in this area. So, yeah, if anyone knows, give me a shout and I'll update in the description. Sonically, this song really confirms what John McBain kind of came forward in those comments to say, where Oppenheimer sounded like a band taking a light psychedelic trip out of the desert. Otis sounds like what came before. To me, it's really reminiscent of the heavy but melancholic vibe of Caius's last record, And the Circus Leaves Town, and the guitar tones actually sound very close to the specific tracks on that album, like Rodeo. What's interesting is, despite being a song known only by like the most obsessed of Queens of the Stone Age fans, in some ways it might be one of the most widely known by the general public. And I say that because the bones of this track, the overall movements and progression, was actually resurrected by Homme when he collaborated with Uncle on the track Chemistry from the 2007 album War Stories. Uncle are like nowhere near as well known as an entity as Queens are, but being that they, or James Lavelle I should say, make a lot of like instrumental and atmospheric tracks, they get used a lot on TV and in film. And I remember distinctly when Chemistry was released, it was used a ton in the years immediately after its release, like ads, TV shows, documentaries, it was everywhere. So this hidden gem, this like if you know you know, obscure as hell early Queens of the Stone Age track, has in some ways had about as much airplay to mainstream audiences maybe as some of the band's biggest singles, which is kind of cool. All right, so we're at the end of this list with what I think is the most obscure unreleased Queens track, the song Anderson Anderson. Unlike Oppenheimer's Brother, where we somehow knew of its recorded existence, Anderson has never shown up outside of one live performance in the band's very earliest days. It's never been spoken about in interviews. There are no studio notes or whiteboards suggesting it was being worked on for an album. Nothing. The song made its one and only debut at the OK Hotel in Seattle, February 98, and as records go, this was Homme's fourth ever documented show under the name Queens of the Stone Age, and the band's lineup was dramatically different. This was before even Nick Oliveri had been asked to join the band. At this show, joining Homme, you had John McBain on guitar, the Screaming Trees Van Connor on bass, his one and only show with the group, Alfredo Hernandez on drums, his first show with the band, and on co-lead vocals, a guy called The Kid. Real name Jason Albertini. The Kid came from the bands Duster and Helvetia, and it is said, but not explicitly proven, that the plan was for him to join Homme on shared vocal duties in Queens, but for whatever reason, the plans kind of didn't materialize. There's a full recording on YouTube of the one and only show featuring Albertini in the lineup, and you can hear him take lead vocals on early versions of Mexicola, The Bronze, and How to Handle a Rope, as well as Anderson Anderson. It's really cool and presents like a doorway into a parallel version of Queens of the Stone Age that I guess exists in some other universe. Another mystery in the Queen's canon, the story of Anderson Anderson puzzled fans for decades, but we have to give it up to Reddit user Rafa Karinga, who asked John McBain himself, who apparently confirmed it was just a song they wrote and rehearsed during that day, played it that night, and never played it again. In hindsight, it's pretty cool someone was there to actually record it, otherwise we'd never even know it existed. All right, there we go. 10 unreleased, hidden, non-album, deep cut Queens tracks and their stories. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to put a playlist up with as many tracks that are as available on streaming as they are, and where they're not, maybe perhaps some songs that inspired them. You can check that out, my other Queens content, my newsletter of new album reviews, all in the description. And if you can be asked to do all that, you may as well subscribe, stick around, share some thoughts, show some love, or just howl some abuse in the comments. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. All right, mate, take care. Mine, there you go. Cheers. Bye.